Greetings. Thank you for tuning into this 2020 general election candidate forum for 22nd District Legislative Representative, position number 2. The forum is presented by the League of Women Voters of Thurston County, along with Thurston Community Media. This forum is being held electronically due to COVID-19. Candidates, moderators, and timers are all joining in on Zoom links with the help of TCMedia. A bit about the League. The League is a nonprofit organization that encourages the informed and active participation of citizens in their government. The League neither supports nor opposes candidates or parties. We are nonpartisan. The League registers new voters, studies issues, and advocates for its positions with the legislature and other governmental bodies. Despite its name, the League is open to everyone age 16 and up. I'm Sue DUBUISSON from the League, and I'll be moderating this forum. A timer will hold up a sign when you have 30 seconds left, and then again when you need to stop. The candidates for this position are Jessica Bateman and Dusty Pierpoint. For this forum, each candidate will have the opportunity to respond to a series of questions in alternating order and ending with 1-minute closing statements. Some of the questions have been contributed by the Asian Pacific Islanders Coalition, South Puget Sound chapter. For the following questions, the first respondent will have 2 minutes and the subsequent respondent will have 1 minute to respond. I will alternate the questions between the candidates so that each candidate has a chance to start first. So we'll start with you, Dusty, for the first question. What steps will you take to ensure that people of color are treated fairly by law enforcement and within the state criminal justice system? What would you track to measure that progress?
Thank you and good morning. Having worked in law enforcement for over 30 years, this has been a discussion that's been ongoing. And obviously, racism and systemic racism is a huge discussion in our communities right now. Some of the things that we did to work with the communities is we went to places of worship. I've been to a mosque, I've been to a Buddhist temple, I've been to a Catholic church, I've been to a Baptist church to meet with the clergy of those congregations and find out what they're hearing from their congregations, because that's really important. The religious leaders know what's going on in their communities, and that's a really good place to find information. Another thing we did is tried to hire police officers that match the demographics of our community. I think that's very important. And we had a school resource officer program because it's very hard to recruit officers if young adults don't trust the police. So the school resource officer program was one way to ensure that we were building trust and bonds with all communities within the school district and our community, because hiring and matching the demographic is a good place to start. Now, as far as the criminal justice system, there's many safeguards in the criminal justice system that could be measured. There's prosecutors, there's defense attorneys, there's judges. And I think at each level of those criminal justice institutions, there should be records kept, statistics kept, and commonly referred to, perhaps maybe even reviewed annually to see if there are numbers that don't fit the demographic of the community and why is that. It's not I don't think it's uncommon for people to understand that money can buy you better attorneys and experts. And so the court system really could be looked at holistically on its fairness, based on monetary. Time's up, sorry.
Jessica, the question again. What steps will you take to ensure that people of color are treated fairly by law enforcement and within the state criminal justice system? What would you track to measure that progress?
Thank you. We undoubtedly know that we have a long and tragic history of institutionalized racism in our country, and that permeates within our criminal justice systems and our law enforcement systems in the United States. And I think we've attempted reforms in communities all over the country, and we're still seeing violence committed against people of color and a disproportionate use of force and the criminalization of crimes and profiling of individuals of color. So I think it's really important that we have accountability, transparency, and a change in the culture. So we need oversight for officers regarding complaints that they've received that are publicly available. I personally am a proponent of the idea of licensing law enforcement officers, like we license other professionalized licenses, like nurses, for example, making that information publicly available so people know about that, demilitarizing the police, restricting use of force, requiring de-escalation, banning chokeholds, requiring comprehensive reporting, and also we have to change the way that we view public safety. Thank you.
Thank you. Jessica, you'll go first in this question. What do you think are the most urgent priorities for the legislature to address in 2021?
Well, many challenges facing my constituents in the 22nd District in Olympia, housing affordability, access to healthcare, comprehensive behavioral health services, the impact of climate change. But as we look to a 2021 session, it is paramount that we address our budget deficit, which is looming. We have a $9 billion budget deficit for the next biennium. That's the 21 to 23 biennium. This is unprecedented for our state. We're going to have to be extremely innovative and think really, really hard about how we're going to address that together. I think first and foremost, we need to get meaningful and comprehensive relief from our federal government, not only for our state, but also our local governments, because cities across Washington are facing budget deficits as well. We also need to look at progressive revenue options, because when we have to consider potential cuts to balance a budget, we're going to have to look at equity and how those cuts could potentially impact the very people that need them most, disadvantaged individuals, folks that are low income, especially with the discussions going on about racial justice. We absolutely have to consider and move forward on progressive taxation, like taxing the highest paid CEOs in Washington state, excessive salaries, things like that, before we even consider any cuts that we would make. And when we make decisions about potential cuts, we have to think about equity and think about those cuts through an equity lens. Thank you.
Dusty, the question again is, what do you think are the most urgent priorities for the legislature to address in 2021?
Thank you. Obviously, we are going to be in a major deficit as we go into 2021. We have some requirements. Education has been and will continue to be a top priority to be fully funded, as we know. And infrastructure. COVID has really shown us when the economy slows down, when businesses are slowed down, it permeates across all areas. So we need to make sure our infrastructure allows for our commerce and our tourism. And we had over a $2 billion budget surplus at the beginning of this year. We need to do a better job of reserves for bad times. And the budget cycle is going to go up and down, and it will continue. New taxes, with everything people have gone through during this pandemic, I do not think adding taxes to everything they're dealing with would be a good idea. Yes, cuts may have to be made, but I think there's smart ways to do that. Thank you.
Dusty, you'll go first on this question. With about 60,000 undocumented Asian American and Pacific Islanders in Washington state, how will you prioritize future relief to underserved, limited English-speaking immigrant and refugee communities, especially undocumented community members who have been excluded from relief packages?
When I began law enforcement, there was a huge influx of refugees. And we had first-generation refugees that couldn't speak English. The children in the house actually were the second language that typically we had to use for interpreters and those types of things. So that is a very serious issue. And making sure that we're connecting with those communities to find out exactly what are the problems, what are the issues, because they may not be the same across the board, and working with them. And once again, I go back to places of worship. That is where you can really connect with people and find out from the congressional leaders, the people that oversee those places of worship, what their congregations are going through. I would start there and find out what truly are the needs. Obviously, our schools would be part of that because they are the ones that are going to be dealing with the children and ultimately the family as a whole. And so finding out specifically what the problems are and how the scope of those problems is very important before you start throwing out solutions. Thank you.
Jessica's question then is, with about 60,000 undocumented Asian American and Pacific Islanders in Washington State, how will you prioritize future relief to underserved, limited English-speaking immigrant and refugee communities, especially undocumented community members who have been excluded from relief packages?
Thank you for that question. So it's undoubtedly the issues that are affecting constituents across Washington State are also impacting those Asian Pacific Islander community members as well, except for the difference being, in many cases, they're not eligible for the relief and the support. So it's incredibly important for us to lead with our values and ensure that all individuals from various communities, whether they're undocumented or not, have access to the same relief that our other community members have in Washington State. We have a history of doing that. Just recently, the governor provided relief for individuals in our Latino immigrant communities that are agricultural workers that were excluded from the federal government COVID relief efforts. I think going into the 2021 session, equity, again, will be first and foremost. So the discussions that we have about revenue, about potential cuts, we're going to be looking at those communities especially to make sure that they have the resources that they need to thrive.
The next question, Jessica, you will answer first. What do you think of the governor's approach to addressing the COVID-19 pandemic? And is there anything you think should be done differently?
Did you say the last part, anything that I think should be done differently?
Yes, I'll repeat the whole question.
Thank you.
What do you think of the governor's approach to addressing the COVID-19 pandemic? And is there anything you think should be done differently?
Honestly, I think that Governor Inslee has done a tremendous job of keeping us all safe. He came out immediately and provided some clear direction, even in the beginning when there was a little uncertainty about how COVID was being spread and the way that it was being transmitted. I know that there's always more that we can do. I think first and foremost, we need to continue safely distancing ourselves so we don't continue to spread the disease and we bend that curve. We need to make sure that we protect public health and those essential workers in those hospitals to ensure that they're not being inundated with those cases and that our hospitals have access to treating patients. It's also important that we have more adequate PPE, I would say the personal protective equipment for our medical providers. We currently do not have enough of that, so that's something that I think that we could do better on. Also, contact tracing. This is going to be with us for another year. I just listened to Dr. Fauci this morning, and even if a vaccine is available by the end of 2020, by the time it's actually out being implemented in our communities, it could be the end of 2021 before we see that. So we need to be able to go back to business. We need to be able to do that safely, and we need to have adequate testing in order to do that as well. I think that we also need to work to find ways that we can provide childcare for our small businesses and our businesses in our communities. That's one piece of input that I have received continually, is that there's not enough childcare. There wasn't before the pandemic. And then with the social distancing requirements, less people are able to have their children in those places, and it's more expensive for them to provide those services. So I think we really need to think about concrete steps that we can take to help provide more childcare services and subsidized childcare services for those that cannot afford it.
Dusty, I'll repeat the question. What do you think of the governor's approach to addressing the COVID-19 pandemic? And is there anything you think should be done differently?
Well, it's very easy to look back and say this is what should have been done. And I think governors across this nation have been dealing with a very difficult situation. And as was said earlier, things change as we move forward. We don't know where this is going still. And so what I would like to see is more work done for small business. Because what I've seen throughout this is essential businesses have been open since day one. grocery stores, home building stores, drive-through coffee stands, but other small businesses have been hurt terribly or had to close completely. And so just more work to help those small businesses get open, those employees get back to work. And Jessica's correct. Daycare, especially now with schooling from home and everything else, is a big issue. But I think we can be smart about opening all businesses, just like the businesses that have been open from day one. And if you are a high risk, that's up to you to stay away from people that aren't wearing masks or aren't social distancing and be safe. Thank you.
The next question, Dusty. The pandemic has revealed deep problems within our healthcare system, including mental health. What steps would you take to ensure people have access to care and can afford it?
The mental health system, particularly in Washington State, I think is failing. From the Western State Hospital not being up to the standards that it could be, has trickled down to all communities. We need to do a better job with mental illness. I think we've spoke about this before, but police officers are getting called to people in mental crisis way too often. And unfortunately, our jails have way too high a percentage of mentally ill people in the jails, where that's not where they should be. They should be in treatment. We are not funding treatment for our mentally ill, and it's showing up in our jails, in our homeless camps, and other places. And so we definitely need to do a better job. How can we guarantee that? We need to put funding toward proper treatment, proper facilities, and try to get people the help that they need, because there is a huge need out there and it's not being funded properly. Thank you.
Jessica, question. The pandemic has revealed deep problems within our healthcare system, including mental health. What steps would you take to ensure people have access to care and can afford it?
Thank you. Well, we have seen an increase in those behavioral health challenges within our communities. I think you look back to the deinstitutionalization of folks within this country, and then a lack of actually providing comprehensive supports and services in community-based settings over decades, compounded with affordable housing crises, economic injustices that are happening now with the COVID crisis. We are seeing that be exacerbated. I think that, in Washington State, we have robust healthcare benefits for those that are on Medicaid, which include behavioral health, and the state has integrated behavioral health into primary care, meaning that anyone should be able to have access to that. The challenge is that we don't have enough workforce and providers that can actually provide those services. So we need to work with our community and technical colleges to make sure that we have workforce programs to encourage occupations like social workers, licensed mental health counselors, making sure that those are competitive wage jobs. So those are jobs that they want to take. And we also make sure that we have those resources within schools, because the schools themselves are saying we need these additional supports within the school system.
Now, each of you will have the opportunity to ask the other candidate a question, who will have 1 minute to respond. And then if you'd like another minute to respond to your own question, I'll turn to you and ask you if you'd like to do that. So, Jessica, would you like to ask Dusty a question?
Sure. Hi, Dusty.
Hello, good morning.
Good morning. I think one of the areas that we have different opinions on, which is great for our constituents to hear, is on taxation. So you might be aware that we are the most regressive state in the country for how we tax individuals. So what do you think about that? How do you feel about that going into a budget deficit? You talked about, priorities, but fundamentally to that is how we fund it. So how can you explain the regressivity of our tax system and how you would address that?
Dusty?
And you're right. I think we do disagree in this area. As I said earlier, we had a $2 billion surplus at the beginning of this year. So yes, COVID has changed things, but this is a snapshot. Our economy was strong, and getting our economy back will help. Taxing people, particularly during this time, I just don't think is the way to go. And I know I've heard carbon tax being brought up before, and that's another one where I feel like we're not giving people options. They have to drive big trucks. They have to drive tractors and big machinery. They don't have a choice. So we will tax them with a carbon tax. That will trickle down to everyone. Sorry, did I see the stop sign down there? 30 seconds. That carbon tax, we will all be paying for that in housing, in our food, and other products. And so I am against an income tax, particularly while everybody is hurting right now. I think the economy needs to come back. And as we've shown over the last few years, we had a surplus in budget. We need to do a better job at reserves for the state budget for these times. Thank you.
Jessica, do you want to respond to your question?
Oh, I get to respond? Sure. The difference that we have, regressivity speaks to the people in our state that are paying more in taxes in proportion to their income. So when you have the highest income earners in Washington paying less in taxes than those lowest income earners, that's what makes it regressive. So even if we had a surplus, that doesn't mean that we have a progressive tax system. And I truly believe that we need to transform the way that we tax people in Washington state so we can provide a robust social safety net, provide workforce training for jobs that provide everyone with the ability to make a livable income and have dignity. And the way that we do that is through tax reform. There's a bipartisan tax reform work group in the legislature that I'm very excited about. And they're discussing things like reforming our tax system and all the tax cuts that we currently give, actually reforming or eliminating the business and occupation tax. And then also this discussion about progressive taxation where the wealthiest in Washington state are not paying their fair share.
Dusty, did you want to ask Jessica a question?
Sure. With everything that's been going on in our nation, there's been a lot of protest, but there's also been a lot of rioting and destruction. What would you do to try to reduce the amount of damage and violence in our communities?
Sure, you're right. It's important to note that the protests and the rioting that has happened is happening across this country. There's a tremendous amount of angst, fear, frustration. People are protesting and exercising their constitutional right to protest in response to hundreds of years of racial injustices that have occurred in this country. And we've seen people peacefully do that, peacefully protesting. We have also seen people that are taking it further and actually breaking the law. And we actually have seen people be assaulted in our community. And I think it's really important that we continue to talk about the distinction and distinguish between peaceful protests and rioting. So we have laws on the books in Olympia that allow us to actually enforce the law, not, if someone's breaking the law, we will enforce that. I think we're going to have to make some reforms about racial justice and reform some of those systems to instill trust in our community and engage with our community. And then also, getting back to a healthier economy, I think people will naturally want to engage in different ways. There's a lot of uncertainty right now, which I think can lead to social unrest. But we do have to make a concerted effort to work with people and address the racial justice issues in our communities.
Each candidate will now provide a 1-minute closing statement. We'll start with you, Jessica.
Thank you. In the 22nd, we need an experienced and progressive leader working for our communities. I've dedicated my career to fighting for the people of Thurston County, for working families, seniors, and our most vulnerable. And in the legislature, I will ensure that our state budget reflects our values and our priorities, especially during a period of economic recovery. I will continue working to improve the lives of the people of Thurston County so that we all have an opportunity to thrive. I am proud to have earned the legislative endorsements from Congressman Denny Heck, Senator Sam Hunt, Representatives Lori Dolan and Beth Dolio, the Washington State Labor Council, the Washington Education Association, our local firefighters, the Sierra Club, Washington Conservation Voters. If you'd like to learn more about me or contact me, please visit my website at votejessicabateman.com.
Dusty?
Thank you. Experience. I have over 30 years living and working in the most diverse community in Thurston County. I helped develop the School Resource Officer program for the largest school district in Thurston County. I was a board member of the Washington State Sheriffs and Police Chiefs Association. I was on the committee that evaluated standard compliance for law enforcement agencies statewide. The Lacey Police Department had one of the lowest crime rates in Thurston County and was one of the most diverse. I have experience working on complex issues to find common ground. And I have seen the impact of small business has been subjected to and will encourage protecting citizens from violence and private property from vandalism. No community can thrive until the citizens feel safe. I've been endorsed by mainstream Republicans, Log Cabin Republicans, Washington Affordable Housing Council, Washington Farm Bureau PAC, 2 former secretaries of state, 3 former mayors of the city of Lacey, a former and a current Lacey Fire Commissioner. I have the experience that is needed to support the 22nd District. Thank you.
Thank you, Jessica Bateman and Dustin Pierpoint, for participating in this forum. We also thank Thurston County Media for producing this forum, and the Asian Pacific Islander Coalition for its contribution. The forum will be available on the Thurston Community Media channel, on the League website, and through a YouTube video shortly after the forums are concluded. We're glad you have taken the opportunity to view this forum. We remind you to vote in the general election beginning October 16 and closing on November 3rd, 2020.